Good evening. One of the big stories that we're tracking here on WION is the situation in Israel. It is going from bad to worse. More than 1,000 rockets were fired last night. Entire buildings have been brought down. Many people have lost their lives. And both sides, the Hamas on one side and the Israeli government on the other, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, have said that they will only expand the offensive. Where does this leave Israel and the region? To discuss this developing story, we're being joined by Jason D. Greenblatt. He is the former White House envoy to the Middle East, the man who negotiated peace deals under President Donald Trump. Jason Greenblatt, welcome to WION.
Thank you, Palki. Thank you for having me. And let me express my support for the people of India. My family and I are praying for the health and recovery of all those who are ill and the full recovery from COVID with what's going on in India.
Thank you so much, Jason. You've just returned from Israel and you were telling me about how you've spent the night in a bomb shelter. What is your impression of the situation on the ground right now?
Well, it's definitely escalating, and I want to explain that Hamas began this offensive. They launched hundreds of rockets yesterday. Yesterday evening, I was about to sit down for a business dinner, and sirens went off. I had to go to the shelter. And who was in the shelter with me? Arabs, Jews, Muslims, Christians, men, women crying, people trying to comfort each other. We had to go in and out multiple times. The airport was shut down. Hamas is firing just indiscriminately at Israelis. Israelis have been killed. Of course, Palestinians in Gaza have been killed as well with Israel's retaliation. But it's impossible for Israel to defend itself without firing back, without deterring Hamas, stopping Hamas in its tracks. Hamas is a terrorist organization that is funded by Iran, wants nothing other than to destroy Israel, and it creates suffering, tremendous suffering, for the 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza.
I know your sympathies lie with Israel, and I know that Hamas is firing rockets, but so is the Israeli side. Why do you think this conflict escalated so quickly? It takes two to tango, they say.
So, Palki, let me correct that. While I am a huge Israel supporter, and I make no secret of that, my sympathies don't lie with anyone other than peaceful people. What's happening now is a battle between good and evil, and it's very similar to the situation that happened to me in Saudi Arabia in January. I was on the runway in Riyadh waiting to take off to Jeddah with my son, and Houthi terrorists fired rockets at Riyadh, and our flight was delayed. Similarly, last night, the airport in Israel had to shut down, and my flight luckily took off, and I'm now home with my family, safe and secure. But I don't think it's fair to characterize me as unsympathetic to Palestinians. And where does it stop? Hamas has to understand that unless and until they reform, and that's a big if, I don't know that they ever will, but unless and until they reform, no peace agreement will ever happen between Israel and the Palestinians. There won't be a real future for the Palestinians. Israel will continue to thrive and prosper, and the Palestinians will be left further and further behind. It can only stop when terrorists stop attacking civilians. And I firmly believe, in most of this country, at least in the United States, most of our country believes that Israel has the full and absolute right to defend itself.
I think it would be fair to presume that most sides would like peace, except for the stakeholders who want to be in power. There's international pressure on Israel to de-escalate, but Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, for one, has vowed to expand the offensive, and the Hamas shows no signs of relenting either. How do you read the Prime Minister's actions?
I think the Prime Minister, and he's supported probably by most of his government, will do whatever it takes to save Israeli lives, Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, and everything else. That's his job, that's his obligation. I can think of no rational leader, no country in the world who would tolerate what's happening from any neighbor or anywhere else being attacked and not do what it has to do to protect its citizens. So I fully support what the Israeli government is doing. I condemn Hamas. I don't think any international pressure to demand Israel to de-escalate without Hamas laying down its weapons is fair or appropriate. The world needs to speak up against terrorism, period, whether it's the Hamas terrorists in Gaza, Houthi terrorists in Yemen, wherever it may exist. They are going to hold back the world unless we all speak in one voice. And demanding Israel to calm things down is not the way anyone would demand from any other country if they were attacked the way Israel has been attacked over the last 36 hours.
Jason, I'm just playing the devil's advocate here. There are critics on both sides. One side says that this conflict and this escalation gives Hamas some sort of legitimacy as they try to take a leadership role in Palestinian affairs, in the Palestinian movement. On the other side, they say that it comes at the perfect time for Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has failed to form a government and lost his majority, and this is an excuse for him to cling on to power. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the first point is very valid. I think that this is a perfect opportunity for Hamas to try to take over. Everybody on the Palestinian side is upset that the Palestinian Authority stopped the potential elections. Palestinians have no chance at electing leaders that they want, leaders who could bring them potentially to a better future without those elections. And Hamas is taking advantage of trouble now, funded by Iran, in order to get there. So I agree with that statement. On the Prime Minister Netanyahu's side, I think it's just a bit cynical to try to mix politics with a national emergency. I was there. I was on the ground. I was in the bomb shelters that evening. This is not in Benjamin Netanyahu's control. He's not using this as a way to get back into politics. Will it affect politics? No doubt. But right now, his job and focus and those of all of Israel's leadership and government are to save Israeli lives and to make sure that they try to do as best as possible to set the stage to prevent further attacks.
The way things are going, do you see an all-out war breaking out?
I don't know. I don't want to get into any kind of prediction, certainly not that kind of prediction, but it's certainly a very, very tense time. And that tension, of course, always spills into the region and beyond. And that's why I think it's even more important for the international community to side with Israel, to demand that Hamas lay down its arms, because it is terrible for the Palestinians, for Israelis, and for the general region.
Where does this escalating violence leave the peace deals that you steered personally, considering that the countries that normalized ties with Israel recently, like the UAE and Morocco, have strongly criticized the raids?
Well, I don't know. This is a long game, right? So hopefully it will not affect the Abraham Accords or others from wanting to join in the Abraham Accords. I think right now everybody's focus is on trying to keep calm, trying to preserve lives and, of course, defend lives. And my hope is that it will not affect those peace deals. That's with Israel and its Arab neighbors as well as Morocco. When it comes to the Palestinian issue, there is no peace without Hamas changing. So I've always said that if Hamas remains in the picture the way it is, it doesn't matter even if the parties were to begin negotiating some of the core issues. We can't even get to the core issues until we uproot terrorism. Terrorism is an enemy to both Palestinians and to Israelis.
Indeed it is. What about Saudi Arabia? There was strong criticism from Saudi Arabia of Israel's actions. Would you say that any hopes of normalization of ties with Riyadh are all but over, at least for the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think Saudi Arabia has to do what it has to do to protect its own national interests. Each of those countries has a certain view on the conflict and a certain view on the Palestinian issue. I can't criticize any of those countries' statements. I think they're doing the best they can to be as balanced as they can. I would like to see some recognition of Israel the same way I support Saudi Arabia, loud and clear when it's attacked. I would love to see if Saudi Arabia or some of the Arab countries could acknowledge what is going on with Hamas. I have not followed all of the traffic, so I don't know what is being said in those countries, but I think any rational, honest country should recognize what is happening on the ground. This is entirely Hamas's fault. While we hope that things will de-escalate, de-escalating temporarily also doesn't fix the problem.
What are Israel's expectations from the international community, from India also, because we know that one of the victims in these rocket attacks was an Indian woman?
Yes, very tragic. All these deaths are tragic. Israelis and Palestinians as well, other than, of course, the terrorists. My condolences to her family. I think that India is a strong friend of Israel's, and I would also like to see the government of India issue a condemnation of Hamas and a request that Hamas lay down its arms so that there can be calm. Unless Hamas stops shooting rockets, I don't know that there's going to be any calm.
You recently criticized the United States for not standing with Israel, but reports also say that the U.S. just blocked a United Nations Security Council statement on Israel. The UNSC held an emergency meeting but could not reportedly agree on a joint statement because of opposition from Washington. How do you see the Biden administration's position on Israel?
I think the Biden administration is a supporter of Israel. I agree with them that they're not picking up the peace file right now. They are sending, I just read in the news, they are sending the State Department envoy for the peace process to try to help the parties. I don't know that he's going to get anywhere because we do not talk to Hamas as a terrorist organization. But on an overall basis, I commend them for not trying to wade into a peace process between Israel and the Palestinians at the moment. That said, I think that their condemnation of what's going on is a bit mixed. They do say Israel has the right to defend itself, but then they also say that, for example, they should avoid injuring civilians. Well, that's problematic because every country, any good country like Israel, like the United States, like India, of course, in defending themselves would try to avoid hitting civilians. But Hamas puts most of its weaponry within civilian areas. So if what they're saying is don't hit the places where the attacks are coming from, and those places are within civilian areas because Hamas does that, what's Israel supposed to do? Just let the rockets keep coming? So I think that the condemnation and the support for Israel could be a bit stronger, but I have no criticism at the moment of the Biden administration. I think they are watching this closely and have a difficult job at the moment, and I wish them luck in trying to help the parties.
Let me quote Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu again, and this is what he said recently in reference to Hamas. This is just the beginning, he said. We will strike them with hits they did not dream of. Do we really need this in the middle of a pandemic, Jason? And I ask this because Israel is a democracy. Israel is also the stronger party, and the onus is that much more on them to ensure that this is resolved sooner rather than later.
I never bought into the stronger party issue. Imagine if India was attacked by a party that's stronger than India. Would we ever tell India, don't defend yourself because you're stronger than another party? Who's stronger doesn't matter. The fact is, Israel has been attacked, Israelis have been killed, and Hamas started it. Hamas is interested in nothing other than the destruction of the state of Israel. To me, the stronger party doesn't matter. It's not Israel's obligation as the stronger party to allow itself to be attacked. What is Israel's obligation, in particular the Prime Minister, is to defend everybody living in Israel, the citizens of Israel, this poor Indian woman who was killed. That is the Prime Minister's job, is to defend Israel from attack, no different than Prime Minister Modi would have to defend all Indians and anybody living in India from attack if it were attacked by a neighbor.
I have to agree with you there. Jason Greenblatt, thanks very much for joining us. And I understand and I appreciate you joining us on such short notice. You've just landed from Israel to the US, and I'm sure the experience is still fresh for you. You've seen what was happening on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.